In the spring of 1937, Lester Warfel Brockelhurst Jr., along with his girlfriend Bernice Felton, went on a gripping crime spree for 6 short weeks that seemed to become their crime spree as they traveled across state lines, leaving behind a trail of shocking crimes. Dozens of armed robberies and at least 3 murders. And because their behavior was so insane, they were also known as the crime tourist. Facing the heavy sentence of death, Lester learned that his girlfriend had been acquitted. His heart became incredibly complicated. In the last moments of his life, he slowly lowered his head and fell into a deep thought. No one knew what he was thinking. Before he was executed, he said, "The only thing that brought me down to this was a slight love affair with a girl. I do not want her to get the chair, but she is just as guilty as me." Peoria, Illinois is a city of hundreds of thousands of people known for its beautiful surroundings and clean air, but it has an alarmingly high crime rate. According to statistics, there are approximately 43 crimes per 1,000 residents, and on average, 1 out of every 23 residents is likely to be the victim of a violent crime or robbery. There was also a serial killer born here decades ago named Lester, but he's not as well known. On a typical Sunday in January 1914, a couple welcomed their second child, Lester, into the world. They already had an older daughter, so they had a lot of experience with raising and educating kids. Maybe it was a job change or a search for a new place to live, but 6 months after Lester was born, the family moved to Galesburg, 48 miles away. There, Lester finished elementary school. In 1921, Lester's parents became Mormons. 5 years later, they moved again, this time because Lester's father found work as an interior decorator in Dallas. In Dallas, Lester continued his high school education, but for reasons unknown, the family relocated again, this time back to Illinois, settling in the village of Marquand, just 21 miles from Galesburg. While he was there, Lester finished high school. To gain more work experience, he joined his father's painting and interior decorating company, which had relocated from Dallas. During high school, he tried out theater and public speaking, but he got hurt trying to pole vault. That injury kept him from playing on the track and field team and from working in jobs that needed a lot of physical strength. So he decided to try some office work. After a few months, he went back to Galesburg and kept studying at a local Sunday school. He was elected president of the Mormon Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association, which is a big community service and leadership role. It looked like Lester's life was moving in a positive direction. He worked hard and was active in his community. But even though he seemed to have it all together on the outside, on the inside, it was a whole other story. No one really knows what made him turn to crime, but it seems like his relationship with Bernice was a big turning point. It was like a spark that set off changes in his life, making him stray from the path of success he was on before. In 1934, Lester's family went to the Missionary Conference in Illinois. It was a pretty religious event, but it had an artistic vibe going on too. They had all kinds of competitions like musical performances, plays, and public speaking. Lester entered the public speaking contest, and it was during this contest that he met the girl who would influence his life, 15-year-old Bernice, who was in the dramatic performance. The two met during the conference and quickly fell in love. This was during the Great Depression, when money was tight for everyone. Even though their families weren't poor, they couldn't see each other very often because their families lived 165 miles apart. That's a long way to go just to visit, but Lester was in love with Bernice, and he couldn't stand the thought of being apart. So every 2 weeks, he'd buy a bus ticket and travel a few hours to see her. Even on the days he couldn't see her, he'd write letters to keep the connection going. Money was always an issue for Lester. Whether it was buying tickets or paying for daily expenses, it was a lot of pressure. By January 1935, Lester and his dad had a big argument about money. The young and impulsive Lester decided to run away from home. He hitchhiked and started on a journey to Chicago. In Chicago, Lester's life took a wild turn when he bought a gun, robbed a candy store, and then 2 women on the street, taking their purses. The 3 robberies only netted him about $12. The next day, he went to the bank with his dad's check and tried to take out $20 from the account. But the bank staff found the check to be worthless, and after realizing that fraud may have been committed, they called the police out of suspicion. The cops arrested Lester, but they didn't realize he was the suspect in 3 robberies. Lester was in a state of extreme panic and nervousness, and he mistakenly thought the police had come for him because of the robberies. He confessed to committing the robberies without direct questioning from the police. A few days later, Lester's parents and some friends got to Chicago, hoping to protect the young man and pleading with the judge for leniency. But the judge didn't listen and instead set bail for Lester at up to $20,000, a price that was way out of their reach. In the end, Lester was convicted of armed robbery in Chicago and sentenced to 2 years in prison. He started his sentence at Joliet State Prison, but a few weeks later, he was moved to another prison in Pontiac, Illinois. While he was there, he had to follow a bunch of rules. He could visit one person in the prison once a month and send 2 letters to people outside the prison. At first, Lester shared these opportunities with his parents and Bernice. But as time went on, Lester decided to send both letters to Bernice, and she always wrote back 1 letter a week. Those letters were a big deal for Lester. They helped him deal with the monotony of prison life and gave him some much-needed support. But Bernice's support didn't stop there. She asked her dad to help him out, and he did. With her dad's help, Lester got parole after serving just over a year in prison. Bernice's parents had a lot of faith in Lester. They not only defended him legally, but also let him live in their home. While on parole, Lester found a job at a department store, and since his income was low, he also got an apprenticeship at a printing company, using his wages to pay for room and board. Despite the challenges, Lester and Bernice grew close. And for a man, if he truly loved a woman, he wanted nothing more than to marry her. Lester hoped to be married to Bernice in a Mormon temple in Salt Lake City. But the Great Depression made that seem impossible. The printing press cut his pay to $10 a week, and the gap between his dream and reality got wider when he found out his girlfriend was pregnant. That put more financial and psychological pressure on him. Maybe it was these real-life pressures and dilemmas that finally led them to go on a crime spree across 18 states on March 31st, 1937, with robbery as the motive. On March 31st, 1937, a young man named Lester was trying to hitch a ride to his destination. A 45-year-old tailor named John Albin Thinder saw him and stopped his car to ask about his destination. When he found out where he was going, John decided to give Lester a ride. On the way, John tried to break the silence, hoping to make the ride more enjoyable. But Lester was unusually quiet, looking straight ahead with his hands in his pockets, seemingly lost in his own thoughts, and not responding much to John. As they entered the suburbs, Lester pulled out a .38 revolver and pointed it at John's head. John was so terrified that he only followed Lester's orders to drive to a more remote rural area. Eventually, they pulled off onto a deserted lane where they wouldn't be bothered. Lester told John to stop the car and walk towards a bush. John could tell that the young man probably wanted to end his life, but he didn't have the courage to fight back. He could only pray that Lester would have mercy. He fell to the ground, put his hands on his head, and waited for his fate to be decided. After a few minutes, he heard a gunshot. After the killing, Lester calmly returned to his car, got into the driver's seat, started the vehicle, drove to pick up his girlfriend Bernice, and then the two of them drove together in the direction of Salt Lake City. In that city sat the Mormon temple where they dreamed of getting married and starting a new life. Lester and Bernice had only $42 on them at the time, which was nowhere near enough money to get married. It made it very difficult to even pay for gas and food on the trip, so they stopped along the way. When they ran out of money, they would rob passersby who tried to hitchhike. At night, they would spend the night in tourist camps along the highway. One time, Lester robbed a guy at gunpoint at a gas station. He took a big risk of getting arrested and spending hours there, only to end up with a few bucks. When Lester and Bernice arrived in Salt Lake City, they went together to the Mormon temple in hopes of getting married, but they were denied entry due to lack of references. In desperation, they traveled to Dallas to visit friends in the area, where Lester tried to find a job as a store clerk, but jobs were scarce, and his requests for employment were denied. So after a few days, they continued their journey as if on a honeymoon. On April 29th, Lester and Bernice rolled into Fort Worth with hardly any cash. For once, Lester pulled out his gun and picked a grocery store to rob. But he only got a few bucks before he was back on the street, looking for another place to rob. Jack Griffith, 48-year-old, the owner of a local tavern, is a very kind-hearted man. And after witnessing the robbery on the street, he decides to follow Lester in an attempt to take down his license plate number so he can call the police. But he doesn't realize he's following too closely, and Lester spots him. A close-range confrontation leaves Griffith shot in the abdomen and collapsing in a pool of blood, and Lester quickly drives away. Lester and Bernice's next stop was Little Rock, Arkansas, where the police already had their license plate number because of the shooting and robbery in Fort Worth. To avoid getting arrested, they left the car they had stolen from John and dressed up as hitchhikers. They walked to Memphis, Tennessee. There, they met 57-year-old Victor A. Gates, a rich landowner who was driving a new car to Lone Oak, Arkansas. Lester hit up Gates for a ride, but he actually had his pistol ready. When Gates couldn't defend himself, He shot and killed him and dumped his body in a ditch. Before leaving the scene, he searched Gates for his money, watch, and shirt. At this point, Lester and Bernice, a pair of outlaws, were moving from place to place, leaving behind a criminal record of about 40 robberies and holdups, but no other known murders were recorded. After robbing a Philadelphia bakery, they arrived in Dutchess County, NY, the 18th state, on their 6-week crime spree. A few miles north of the state line, New York State Trooper Joseph Hunt noticed a car with only one license plate, which made him suspicious. He decided to check it out and gave the car a chase in his police car for 10 minutes until it pulled over. Hunt went to the driver's window and asked for his license. The driver kept fumbling around in his clothes, so Hunt looked in the back seat and saw blood on the seats and a gun. Then, in a lighthearted tone, he asked, "You do realize that you have blood all over your car, don't you?" Pretending to look for his license, Lester, as he had done with the robberies years earlier, replied, "Yes, and I've committed a couple of murders as well." Eventually, Lester and Bernice were arrested on the spot, and Hunt took them to the police station for more questioning. During the interrogation, Lester admitted that he was the fugitive who had been robbing various establishments over the past few weeks and confessed to the 3 murders. 2 days after his arrest, Lester was taken into custody in Poughkeepsie, while officials from Illinois, Texas, Arkansas, New York, and the federal government talked about which jurisdiction would be responsible for holding and subsequently charging Lester with murder. Lester kept fainting during his interrogation, so the prison doctor had to sedate him. The prison doctor later told the press that Lester's fainting spells were caused by extreme euphoria. While Lester was in the cell, Sergeant Paul Johnson of the Rockford Police Department interviewed him. Johnson wanted to find out if the young man had been involved in the February 12th murder of a gas station operator in the small town of Rockton, near Rockford. The operator had been killed by the same type of gun that Lester had used. Ultimately, the decision was made by then-Governor Herbert H. Lehman of New York to extradite Lester to Arkansas to be placed in the hands of prosecutor George Harche because Arkansas had the strongest case against him. Lester didn't object, saying he wanted to put an end to it all, and he was told he'd face the electric chair no matter what. The prosecutor said he'd sentence Lester and Bernice to death. Bernice's dad tried to save his daughter by telling the press that his daughter had been tricked. He said Lester had no money, so he promised to marry her if she went with him. Lester and Bernice's trial was set for June 14th in Lonoke, Arkansas, and in the time leading up to it, both men were under close surveillance to prevent them from choosing to commit suicide. In fact, they said that if one of them killed himself, the other would do the same. Even though they were held in separate cells, they were still allowed to share meals, the only contact allowed between them. 20 days before the trial was set to begin, Lester's attorneys told the judge they wanted to ask the Supreme Court to delay the trial, and they had already asked for and been denied a 30-day extension. The day before the trial, Lester and Bernice got into a heated argument after Bernice was allowed to appear as a witness against him. At the trial, Lester's lawyer tried to use insanity as a defense, but the prosecution showed that the State Hospital for Neurological Diseases had confirmed that Lester was conscious during the crime. In the end, Lester was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by electric chair. When he heard this, Lester fainted from fear, and his father was devastated. The next day, Bernice's trial began, and after 80 minutes of deliberation, she was found not guilty of the murder charge. The public was outraged, and many believed that Bernice was not innocent and should at least be considered an accomplice. The streets were filled with angry chants calling for Bernice and her father to be attacked if they were seen. Although Bernice was acquitted, she was still sentenced to 5 years in prison for transporting a victim's stolen car from Arkansas to Tennessee, the harshest penalty for the crime. After that, there were appeals to the Supreme Court to reduce Lester's sentence and remove his death sentence, but on November 30th, those appeals were rejected. When he heard this news, Lester was unusually calm. He said that no matter what was said, it wouldn't help him at all. But on March 2nd, 1938, even though there wasn't much hope, Lester's lawyer didn't give up. He joined with 2 doctors and more than 50 residents to sign a petition saying that Lester was mentally ill and unfit to be executed. They argued that it would be unlawful to execute a mentally ill person, but the court rejected the petition. On March 18th, he was taken to the execution chamber, and before the execution, he gave a 12-minute speech. It was basically a confession about his crimes, but he got super angry about Bernice's extramarital affair at the end. He said, "The only thing that brought me down to this was a slight love affair with a girl. I do not want her to get the chair, but she is just as guilty as me." After serving 5 years, Bernice married another man in 1948, and had her first son in Baltimore, but the boy died in an automobile accident at the age of 16. But she got through it and married again, and had 8 kids. That marriage didn't last though, and she ended up dying in 2007